G'day folks, how you going? My name's Chris. I'm a physical chemist by trade, so I did my PhD in spectroscopy, looking at lots of small molecules from the atmosphere, some astrophysical molecules, but I'm also a really passionate educator of chemistry. So I was going to talk to you today about something that's very close to my heart, and I think it's actually very close to everyone's heart, and that is food, and the chemistry of food. And what I'm going to talk about today is cupcakes. Something nice and simple, something that we all like to eat. Let's go back a step, okay? We are bombarded with messages in the media about the kinds of things we should and shouldn't be eating. We should be eating more of this, we should be eating less of that. You know, and a lot of that is not based on good science. But even the experts disagree on a lot of the key points. So what I want to take you through today with a cupcake as my subject is the basic chemistry of food. Okay, what are the atoms and the molecules, the chemicals, and they are chemicals, they're natural, but they're still chemicals. What are the chemicals that we're putting into our mouths to sustain us? So, my thesis that I'm going to prosecute is we cannot live on cupcakes alone. There's a biblical line, yeah? Man cannot live on bread alone. So I'm just, giving my own personal spin on it. So let's talk about it. We'll talk about it in terms of energy. Okay, so we consume food for a number of reasons, but one of the predominant reasons is to energise our systems. And so here we've got a scale of 0 to 100%, and there is the Australian Dietary Guidelines, which tell us how much food we should be eating, and the different types of food, the different types of chemicals. So if we break that down, the biggest contributor is carbohydrates. It's about 60% of the food that we should be eating should be carbohydrates. The next 30% of the energy that we get from food comes from fats and oils, often what we call lipids. Now that might seem like a lot in the first instance, but bear in mind that fat or fat molecules have gram for gram more than twice as much energy as, say, carbohydrates. So what we're really saying is you should probably be eating 6 times as much in terms of mass of carbohydrates than you should be eating of fats and oils. We've got protein making up the last 10%. So protein comes from all manner of sources. We often think of protein as being meat. It's much more than meat. It comes from vegetable sources as well. So let's break down the cupcake and test out my thesis on whether or not we could live on cupcakes alone. Let's start with carbohydrates. In my cupcake recipe, we're running at about 70%. 70% of that energy that you would get from eating the cupcake is coming from the carbohydrates. Now, I know what you're thinking. What sort of carbohydrates, yeah? The elephant in the room here is there are all sorts of different carbohydrates, and some potentially worse for our health than others. So carbohydrates are typically broken down into complex carbohydrates. So we're talking about starch, cellulose, dietary fibre. We also have the sugars. So with the sugars, we've got glucose, fructose and sucrose. That's just to name a few, but they're probably the 3 main sugars that we're consuming in our diet. Now, it's the sugars that we need to keep an eye on. Probably should be limited to about 15% of the energy needs. This molecule here is sucrose, and you'd be pretty familiar with this. This is the stuff you sprinkle on your cornflakes. Actually, this molecule is composed of 1 glucose molecule and 1 fructose molecule put together. So how much sucrose is in my cupcake? It's running at about 50%. Okay, so it's not looking good in the first instance. This is really important. Sucrose has very clear links to the obesity epidemic, which in itself has very strong links to type 2 diabetes. It's very strongly linked to tooth decay, and there are more tenuous links to heart disease and cancer. Okay, so we absolutely have to be limiting the amount of sucrose that we have in our diet. With one caveat about sucrose, it gets a lot of bad press. But bear in mind, we get it from nature, we get it from sugar beet. It's the predominant sugar in pineapples and pears. Okay, it's completely natural. We just have to limit how much of it we consume. So, fats and oils. Before sugar was the bad boy on the street, it was dietary fat that was getting all of the bad press. And absolutely, we should be limiting how much fat we consume as well. And the Australian Dietary Guidelines, about 30% of our diet. So in this case, you can see an example of a fat molecule here. And in my cupcake recipe, it's about 30% of the energy content, which is consistent with what we should be having in our diet. So perhaps it's not so bad here. Perhaps. There are different sorts of fats and oils. In fact, the two terms fat and oil are the same types of molecules. We call the fats the solid variations, 25 degrees, room temperature. If you have a molecule like this and it's a solid, we call it a fat. You guys will be familiar with olive oil and vegetable oil. At room temperature, it's a liquid. We call those the oils, but they're the same types of molecules. They do have structural differences though, and you will have heard of probably saturated fats and unsaturated fats. This is an example here of a saturated fat. Now they recommend that you keep your fat consumption, fats and oils, limit to 10% saturated fats, and the rest should be unsaturated or polyunsaturated fats. So what about my cupcake recipe? It's got a good dose of butter in it. Yeah, butter, solid, about 50% saturated fat. Okay, so probably not a good sign. And this, of course, is why some people replace butter with things like margarine, because it has a higher degree of unsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. I should like to mention, again, there's a caveat here. Fats and oils and other sorts of lipids, phospholipids, so thinking egg yolk is about 1/3 a phospholipid, still a kind of non-polar molecule, what we call a lipid, very important for health. The sterols, such as cholesterol, we don't want too high cholesterol, but some cholesterol is absolutely essential for the health of the cells in our body. So it's really important that we do get some fats and oils and the so-called lipids into our diet. Okay, so the remainder must be protein. In my cupcake recipe, this final macronutrient of protein running at about 3.5%. Now we mentioned before that, for protein, a lot of people think meat. They instantly think meat, that's where I get my protein. There's no meat in my cupcake recipe, you'll be pleased to hear. Okay, so where's the protein coming from? It's coming from the wheat flour. And the molecule that you can see here is a gliadin. Gliadin is one of many proteins that you get from wheat flour. It's one of the predominant proteins. You've possibly heard of gluten. A lot of people, intolerant to gluten. So gliadin is one of the two main proteins in gluten. Okay. You can see in this case here, this molecule has many atoms in it. So we saw sugar, it has, in the order of about 40 atoms. The fat molecule is getting towards 100 atoms. Protein molecules, you're starting to talk about thousands and thousands of atoms at a time. The other key difference is, in contrast to carbohydrates and the fats, which have hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, in this case, protein also has nitrogen. So it's through protein that our body gets its nitrogen. These molecules are so big that it's not typical that we look at them in that ball and stick kind of picture. We often use these so-called ribbon diagrams. Now, this shows the linear chain of amino acids that proteins are made from. So proteins are really basically long strings of molecules which we can break down into amino acids. In fact, if you zoom in, you can see these sort of nice little structures. There are little spirals in there, and that's where this chain of amino acids sometimes spirals in upon itself. We call that secondary structure. This structure is really important for the biological properties that many proteins have. A protein's not just for energy, of course. So proteins make up all sorts of biochemical or contribute to biochemical processes. Think enzymes and so on. So many of these molecules are incredibly important for good health. So over 99% of the energy that we put into our body is from food types, which consist of just 5 elements from the 118 elements available to us in the periodic table. Okay, so what about the rest? There are a whole bunch of elements which are absolutely essential for good health. Think iron. So iron is at the heart of hemoglobin, really important for our blood, obviously. Zinc, the second most abundant micronutrient, as we call these things, really important in metabolism and processes like that. Calcium, really important for bone density. Iodine, 30% of the world's population deficient in iodine. And it's attributed to brain disease and brain damage in a lot of infants and young children, particularly in third world countries. You know, New Zealand actually has really low levels of iodine as well. So they add something like 50 milligrams per kilogram of iodine to table salt. So when you sprinkle table salt on things, you're actually getting iodine, which is really essential for good health for things like thyroid and so on. How about in the first world? Sodium. If anything, we have too much. Yeah, this talk was titled Deficiency to Excess. There's a lot of things we're consuming in excess, particularly in the first world, and sodium is one of those things. Cobalt, it's the metal at the heart of vitamin B12. This is just 8 further elements from the periodic table. So there's still a lot that I haven't even mentioned here, many of which are really important in good health. You probably didn't need me to tell you that a diet of cupcakes alone is probably not a good idea, okay? But yet we yearn for these diets. So you read the popular press, they're constantly talking about these absurd diets, the Atkins diet. The low carbohydrate, high fat diet is one of the latest ones. The raw vegan diet. Yet we're yearning for these diets. But I put it to you, it's not that complicated. We know what sort of molecules, atoms and micronutrients, macronutrients we should be putting into our body. And if you can follow a recipe and bake a cupcake, I put it to you, you can come up with a recipe for the diet that you should be consuming. There's no perfect diet. There's all sorts of different variations. But it is basic chemistry, people, what you should be putting into your body. I've got some good news for you, though, in case you thought, I've just ruined cupcakes for you. The amount of energy in one cupcake, in the daily diet, about 8,700 kilojoules. One cupcake, it's probably about 1,000. So I reckon one cupcake every now and then is probably okay. Thanks a lot.